Hey, welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you have your own question you want answered on a future episode, head right here and you can submit it there, and it might be on a future episode. I got some really good questions this week. Let's talk about it. I currently rotate about 6 different song leaders for church services. After reading some of your tips, I know that they're not all up for the job. I'd like to get my team down to 2 or 3 quality singers who are committed and willing to lead. Does this make sense? How should I go about doing this in a Christ-like manner? Well, before we talk about how you should do it, I think that question that you asked at the end, does this make sense? I think that is the right first question to ask. Does it make sense? You have 6 leaders who I assume have been leading for a significant amount of time in your church, and you have watched some of my videos, I assume, and thought, these people do not live up to the expectations that Spencer has laid out in his videos, or you said you read some things that made you think that, so maybe you read some of my blog posts, whatever it is. Does it make sense if somebody doesn't live up to the things that I talk about to be like, hey, you're not going to lead worship anymore, and we're going to have these other 2 or 3 people take over or keep leading worship in your absence? And first of all, I just want to say, I hope that that's not the takeaway that people are taking away from my videos, is that if people on your team don't live up to the expectations that Spencer just talked about, then I need to kick them off my team and not have them lead worship. Because that's not really what I'm saying. In the videos that I put out, I'm basically giving you the ideal picture of what a worship team member should look like. But that doesn't mean that I think that every worship team member who is ever going to exist and who should be on a worship team are going to live up to those standards, right? Like, this is, whenever I make these videos, I'm teaching things. When we teach things, we say, hey, this is where we're trying to get. I'm teaching it because people aren't there yet, which, by the way, includes myself. Some of the things that I teach in my videos, I'm not doing, if I'm being honest, or I'm not doing them as well as I would like to be doing them. And so in the process, I'm teaching myself. And so if you hear like this ideal picture of what a worship team member should be or a worship leader should be, don't assume that everybody needs to automatically live up to that standard, because that's not how it works. I don't even live up to all of the standards that I put out in my videos. I'm just saying that these are things that we should be shooting for and moving in that direction. So, to get back to your question, does it make sense? It might make sense in your context, and here's what we need to delineate between. We need to talk about what are we aiming for and what is the bottom threshold for somebody to be a worship leader, because there's a big gap between those things, because the gap is I can be on the worship team, and the gap is perfection, which we're never going to reach, right? And so the question you should be asking, and maybe you are asking and you just didn't say in your question, but the question you should be asking is, do these members meet the minimum threshold to be on the worship team? That is the question that you should be asking. And then, does it make sense to have only 3 people lead worship instead of 6 people because the other 3 people aren't up to the task of leading worship? It makes sense if they don't meet that minimum threshold, and you don't ever see them meeting that minimal threshold. It's one thing if somebody wants to join your team and they aren't meeting the minimal threshold, and I understand that that's an ambiguous term, but you set it for your team, and I assume that you have an idea of what that is for your team if you're holding people to a standard like you talked about in your question. I could talk about what the minimum threshold is, but I've talked about that in other videos, and I won't go into it at length here. But let's say you have a minimum threshold, right? If somebody wants to join your team, then you're saying, hey, you can't be on the team because you don't meet the minimum threshold. I need a minimum threshold counter, because I'm going to say that like 50 million times. But you don't meet the minimum threshold. Now, the hard part is if somebody is already on your team like you have, and you feel like they aren't meeting the minimum threshold. Because in that case, I don't think the first step is rarely ever kicking people off your team and saying, hey, you can't lead worship anymore. And maybe you aren't even kicking people off your team. Maybe you just aren't going to have them be the main worship leader anymore. The first step is never to kick people off your team. It is to, if they are already on your team, it is to talk to them about what the minimum threshold is so that they can meet that and continue to be on your team. Because for a lot of people, they don't even know what the expectations are to be on your worship team because we've never clearly communicated them. So if you've never clearly communicated it, maybe you need to clearly communicate it to these people. Now let's talk about the hard part of the question. And this question is interesting because it's really a question that I get all the time. It's just framed in a different way. The question that you're really asking, I think, is how do I have somebody on my worship team who shouldn't be on the worship team? How do I get them off of my worship team? That's what I hear a lot of times is like, I understand that I can say no to somebody who wants to join the worship team, but what if they're already on my worship team? What do I do? So just quickly, a quick process that you can do. Number one, talk to them and tell them what the expectations are if you've never done that. Not even attacking them and saying, hey, these are the expectations and you aren't living up to the expectations. If you've never communicated them before, you can't hold people to those expectations because they didn't know what the expectations were. So maybe when the new year comes, it's always a good time to do it around the new year, you talk to your whole team and say, hey, I haven't done a very good job putting the blame on yourself. I haven't done a very good job of stating the expectations that I have for this team, including for myself. Here's what I want us to focus on this year. And then you lay out whatever your expectations are. Once again, that's ambiguous, and I just thought, I'll link down below the worship team toolkit that I've talked about before, where I will give you the code of conduct that I hand out to my worship team so you can see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these expectations. So give people the expectations, see if those problem people on your team conform to those expectations over the next month or so. If they don't, say to them, hey, we talked about how these are the expectations that we're aiming for this year, and I feel like they're not being met. I'm trying to say it in a way where it's not like attacking somebody, where it's like, I feel like you aren't living up to them. I don't know how to, I'm not very good at framing things in that way, but I feel like the expectations aren't being met. Is there anything I can do to help you meet those expectations? And then from there, you open the conversation up to have it be a conversation where you aren't just attacking them and you give them a chance at redemption. And then hopefully they meet those expectations. If they don't meet the expectations still, then you have another conversation with them, and that's a harder conversation. It's like, we talked about this a month ago, and I still feel like the expectations that we have for the team just aren't being met. And if it continues, then I don't know if we could still have you on the team. I'd love to have you on the team, but these are the things that we've agreed to now this year to aim towards as a worship team, and I feel like we're not getting there together. And then if they still don't conform to the expectations, then it's time to have the conversation where you say, these are the expectations. Listen, we've had a few conversations now about this, and they still aren't being met. And until they're met, I don't think you can be on the worship team. See how it's not just one conversation where you blow up and kick somebody off your worship team. It is a steady process that we move through. So I hope that's helpful for you. Does it make sense to kick people off of the worship team because they don't live up to this standard that Spencer talks about in his videos all the time? Absolutely not. Nobody lives up to the standards that I talk about in my videos, not even me. I don't do it perfectly either, and I'm sure you don't either. So that is the goal that we're aiming for, but not the benchmark. Think about the minimum threshold that somebody needs to be on your team, and then have conversations to try to get them there. If they don't meet that, then you can have the conversation about them not being on your team anymore. Hi, Spencer. What are your thoughts on starting over on a worship team? We are in a small congregation, probably less than 50. My husband and I have been the music ministry directors for about 17 years. He handles the tech/sound side and plays the bass. I handle the leadership side of the worship team and play the acoustic guitar and drums. Our adult son plays the acoustic guitar and sings and leads. When we were given this role, there were already 3 other vocalists. There has never been any structure. We have recently faced many problems, including losing a vital part of the team. I won't be specific about the issues. Suffice to say, we are ready to step down. We are taking a leave right now and would like to begin again by having structure in place and then add members one by one using applications and auditions. It would be easier to do this with a new worship director, but there is no one else who can fit this role. What are your thoughts and suggestions about how to go about this? Maybe there's a better way to start over. We welcome any help or suggestions you have. We appreciate all your resources and tips/ideas and learn so much from you. Thank you, Cindy. Well, Cindy, first of all, I just want to congratulate you on 17 years of service in this church. That is amazing. I don't know many people who have been in a church for 17 years. Like, that is a really long time to serve in one church, and I think that that is admirable. And so, the first thing is, I know that it can be frustrating, especially after 17 years, but leaving the church, I don't think, is a good option. You've been there for 17 years. You're only going to find more problems at another church because every church has problems. There's no perfect church. So it's better to stick where you're at, where you've been at for 17 years and have built relationships with people, than it is to go to some other church and try to figure out problems with people who you don't have a relationship with. So that's the first thing that I want to say. I don't know if you were thinking about leaving, but taking a break sometimes leads in that direction. So you've taken a break. You're on a break, as Ross said in Friends. We were on a break.
We were on a break!
You're on a break, and now you want to come back. And when you come back, you want to do things differently, which is good. I think the first thing, and you've already identified this because you want to do things differently, and I say this nicely, but I think we need to understand it before we move forward, is that you've been at this church for 17 years leading in this capacity. Your ministry is at where it's at right now because of how you've led it for the past 17 years. And I say that because I know that the temptation is there to put on other people the blame, and maybe some of that is founded, some of it is unfounded, but at the end of the day, you're the leader of your ministry. And so we have to take responsibility for the things that we can take responsibility for. And it sounds like you're doing that, and now you want to find how to finally fix things in your ministry. So the first step is realizing where I'm at today is a result of how I've led my church for the past 17 years, or how I've led my ministry for the past 17 years. Now, that sounds like bad news on the surface of it, but the good news is that means how you lead your ministry in the next 10 years also has an effect on your ministry. So the past 17 years happened, let's recognize that, but there are 10, 15, 20 more years in the future where you can lead your church. And that's good news because you have just as much effect today as you had back then. Back then, it didn't work out so well. Let's fix things for the future. Now, when it comes to implementing this change, I love that you have a vision for your worship ministry. I love that you're thinking about, okay, I need a system for how we do things. So it sounds like you have that figured out. I'm sure you've watched some of my videos about worship team rehearsals. It seems like you were referencing some of that. So definitely follow that. A few cautions with that plan is that I know that once you're off of this break and you're back in the swing of things, you're going to be fired up because you've just had a break, maybe for the first time in 17 years, and you're reinvigorated and you've got all these amazing ideas of things that you want to change. But it took you 17 years to get where you were at today. Don't expect all of those 17 years, I'm sure there were a lot of good things, but all of the 17 years of frustrations to be fixed in a month now, right? It took you 17 years to build the frustrated place that you're in right now. It doesn't unravel in 1 month. It unravels over a year, 2 years, maybe. So this is a long-term goal that you're setting for yourself, not a we're going to turn things around tomorrow sort of thing. So have a little patience in this. I know it's hard to have patience, but I think the changes that you want to implement sound good. having a structure for your team. It's just how you do it that is important. And I was talking about this with my pastor just yesterday about some changes in our church. And we were talking about, if we're right here and the ultimate goal is to get up here, then we don't just sprint as the leaders of the church. We don't just sprint to the ultimate destination, because when you do that, you leave everybody else behind. So instead of just jumping up to that, we have to go on a smooth, I'll do it this way because this is how it'll look better for you, a smooth, gradual incline. And this jumping is not shepherding your church or your people in your ministry, but this is shepherding the people in your ministry. And this is a 3-year plan. This is a 1-month plan. In this plan, you lose everybody on your worship team. In this plan, you potentially shepherd people into the new way, and that's the way to do it, but that's not the way that anybody wants to do it because it takes a long time. But it is still the right way. So I want to warn you with that. I would implement small changes. There are some big changes I think that you could do at first, but not everything at once. You need to do it gradually. Now, when it comes to that, whenever you say, I want to start from scratch and I'm going to take everybody off of my worship team essentially and then have them fill out a questionnaire or an application form, because you probably heard me talk about an application form, and then I will have them rejoin the team that way. I wouldn't do that. If people are already serving on your team, and I just talked about this in the last question, so I won't reiterate it too much, but if somebody's on your team and they aren't living up to the expectations, first of all, make sure that you've set the expectations, and then keep putting them in front of them, and then have the conversation with people. This is actually very similar to the last question that I just answered. So hopefully you got something out of that answer as well, because that's more of the situation that you're in. Rarely is it a good idea to strip your ministry down to the foundation and then try to build it back up. I think it's better to slowly, over time, shape and mold it into what you want it to be. So if somebody's been on your worship team, and they've probably been on there for 10 years, 17 years maybe with you, don't just kick them off. Because what that says is that, hey, it's your fault. You've done this wrong for 17 years, when in reality, you were the leader of the ministry. And I know that that's hard to hear. I'm not saying that lightly. But at the end of the day, you were the leader of your ministry. And so now it is your job to slowly transform it into what it needs to be. So I don't know how much practical advice there was in that, but I hope that that gets you in the mindset of this is a long-term change and not something that's going to happen overnight. And so I need to think about not just what changes do I want and how can I get them as fast as possible, but what changes do I want and how do I shepherd my team into meeting those expectations and molding my ministry into what I want it to be. On your most recent video, you mentioned that the hearts must be right. What do you mean by this? May I ask you to be specific on this, please? Levi. Yes, you may. What Levi is referencing is a Real Talk episode that I had a little while ago, and basically the question that I was answering is, who should be allowed on your worship team? Should just anybody be on your worship team? Or are there specific things that people need to measure up to, be able to do, to be on your worship team? And what I was talking about in that video is how sometimes we don't care how musically gifted people are, because we tell ourselves, as long as their hearts are right and in the right place, however I put it in that video, then they can be on the worship team because I love their heart. I love what they're about. And so you want a little bit more skin and bones on what I mean by your heart right. Essentially what I'm referring to in that is that they live up to the code of conduct that you have for your worship team. They live up to the moral expectations to be on your worship team. And I know that that sounds a little bit judgmental whenever you just look at it at the surface, that people have to live up to a moral standard to be on your worship team. But we have to understand that these people on our worship team, they're leaders in our church, and leaders People who aspire to the position of leadership in the church will be held to a higher standard. The Bible says it. So it's okay to hold people to a higher standard when they become a leader in the church. And everybody on your worship team, from the person leading vocally every song to the bass player in the background to the person on auxiliary percussion, they are all leaders in your church. And so it is okay to hold them to a higher standard. So when I'm talking about their heart being right, I'm talking about them living up to that standard that you have for leaders in your church. And my point in the video was, sometimes we're like, okay, they live up to the standard and they meet that requirement, but they're not very good musically. And so they still shouldn't be on the team, because it's not just that they live up to the standard that we've set for leaders in our church. It's not just that they are musicians and can play their instrument well or sing well. It is both of them together, because we are leading musical worship. So if you want to see what my standards are and have some help forming your own, check out the worship team toolkit down in the description below. In that, I will give you the exact code of conduct, the exact handout and application form that I give to my new worship team members, that everybody on my worship team has gone through and understood. And that is what I'm talking about. The certain things in there are having your heart right, and then there are also musical requirements as well in there. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.